Morning, Jason and Stephen. This is Paul Rago, just doing a sound check.
Yeah, you sound good, Paul.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Good morning, Jason. Dan here.
Yep, Dan, you sound good.
Very good. Thank you.
Morning, Stephen. This is Chris. Just checking my audio.
Hey, Chris, you sound good.
Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of our October council meeting here in lovely Lower Delaware. Another beautiful day. Let's get started with the 2025 Atlantic mackerel specifications. Jason, are you ready?
Thank you. Yes, so this is review. Potentially no motions are necessary unless the council wants to make any changes. We're in multi-year specs for 24 and 25, so reviewing for 25. Going to go over some background, talk about the advisory panel's input, and then the SSC recommendation. A few acronyms that will pop up a lot. The SSC, ABC, the acceptable biological catch that the council cannot exceed and is provided by the SSC. The annual catch limit is just the ABC minus Canada for this. It's our accounting threshold that paybacks get triggered on. Mostly for this plan, we'll talk in metric tons. 450 metric tons is about 1 million pounds. 1,000 metric tons, about 2.2 million pounds. This is one of the council's oldest FMPs, set up in 1978. And relatively recently, in the last 15 years, moved to limited access with 3 tiers. Before we got in the current mackerel rebuilding, Tier 1 started with no trip limit in a year. Tier 2, 135,000 pounds. Tier 3, 100,000 pounds, also with a sub-quota, and then 20,000 pounds for open access. Now in rebuilding, because the quota is so low, all of the limited access start at 20,000 pounds and open access at 5,000 pounds. Just a little history of the fishery and where we are today, the scale of the 70s fishery. I think it's kind of hard to imagine. That peak catch was over 430,000 metric tons, which is almost 1 billion pounds. So I think, again, that scale is really hard to imagine. You can see also kind of the other peaks in the late 80s, early 90s, and then the mid 2000s. And one kind of neat thing about our assessment is you can see how those peaks were really fed by 1 or 2 year classes in those peaks. And you have a wide variety of ages in that early 70s fishery that we see in the landings that occurred. And then in those other peaks, you see these single or 1 or 2 year classes that track. You see it year after year in the landings that came in. And then we haven't had a big year in recent years. But unfortunately, while we do see, those year classes tracking to the assessments, like I said, we haven't seen that. And the stock assessment also sees those year classes building into the stock, but at very low levels currently. And kind of our perspective really changed on this fishery. We had a 2018 assessment that integrated a combined egg index from a dedicated Canadian survey and our May-June ecosystem monitoring survey, and kind of convinced us that the old trawl survey was not a good mackerel index. You can see the old trawl survey in the bottom left was kind of increasing. Everything looked more or less hunky-dory. But when you look at that egg survey, on the bottom right panel, you can see the decline that we saw through our other data sources. So the integration of that egg survey is really what changed our perspective on the stock. And so, and it really did change our perspective. In 1997, we had an ABC back then. It was allowable biological catch. That was set 10 times higher than what we now think the entire SSB was in that year. So really our perspective on the stock changed drastically with the current assessment. And so our last assessment was 2023. We didn't see any improvement to the data used in that, which was through 2022. We'll get our next assessment in 25, which will look at data through this year. Another thing to keep in mind, it's really not a factor right now, but we do have a river herring and shad cap for the Atlantic mackerel fishery. Closes the fishery when it's triggered. There's similar caps on the Atlantic herring fishery. It's not that we think those caps are safe amounts of river herring and shad. The council has used a number of ways, mostly focusing on historic rates of encounter for river herring and shad. And there's a lot of concern that our kind of current levels of low observer coverage, we've also had some portside sampling at times, means that that rate that's used to trigger that cap is highly variable. And we've gotten in some cases where it's really been dependent in closed, at least I think the herring one, I'm not sure about the mackerel, on the previous year data. There's a transition period when we're getting in those first observer trips. Potentially you can get closed by prior year data if you haven't gotten enough trips in yet. So where we are currently, we're in this rebuilding plan. Our current ABCs are at 3,200 metric tons. The assessment projections indicate that that gives us about a 60.5% chance of rebuilding the stock by 2032. If you, after these first 2 years, revert to kind of a more typical rebuilding F, those first 2 years were averaged out. But those ABCs are basically designed to support the rebuilding plan of about a 60% chance of rebuilding by 2032. So we deduct a bit for Canada, we deduct about 2,000 metric tons for recreational catch, a bit for discard, commercial discards, and those are just deducted. That's how the commercial quota is deducted in the FMP. So we're at an 868 metric ton US quota currently. So I'm going to highlight some of the information we give our AP to kind of stimulate the fishery performance report and then their input. These are just landings and revenues kind of in the, what I'd say, the modern data time period, 1996 to current. You can see that kind of bump up in the mid 2000s and then low levels since the fishery crashed in 2010, the late 2000s going into 2011. Mackerel prices have been increasing for the most part over time in recent years, and these are adjusted to $2023. Landings details, most landings in 2023 went into Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And it's a little hard to see on this, but I put some purple underlines in the areas where most of the catch has come out of in terms of statistical areas. It's kind of going from Massachusetts and Cape Cod east for 2023, where most of the landings came from. This is the weekly landing reports for 22 and 23, 2022 in orange, 23 in blue. I put that little circle at the end of 23. There was emergency action that shut things down. So landings may have been a bit higher in 23, if not for that emergency action, as we kind of knew we're facing very low quotas going forward. Wanted to make sure we didn't have an overage to deal with. This is 24 in blue, 23 in orange, and those low trip limits this year have been performing about as expected. Once we get to, I think it's 80%, then some more stringent trip limits come in, but the trip limits, it's really trying to allow an incidental level of landings, and so far they've been performing about as anticipated. This is just recreational catches. Consistent for this time period. So we bring that background information to our advisory panel to get their perspectives to create the fishery performance report. It's pretty brief from the AP for mackerel this year. they kind of continue to flag that markets really aren't a limiting factor. It's been an availability issue. They haven't seen fish prior to these last couple years when regulations haven't allowed landings. Still continued concern that when the fishery does get reestablished, those very low river herring and shad caps and low coverage could have negative impacts on them. We've gotten some input that, over the years, from at least one advisor wondering if some of the horsepower restrictions for some of the baselines could kind of reduce the fleet's ability to catch mackerel in terms of tow speed. So this is a summary slide that Paul Rago of the SSC provided. Paul, you want to walk us through this?
Oh, okay. Yeah, thanks, Jason. Yeah, there's no new fishery information available as Jason has described, and the egg survey, which is critically important, will be available for the 2025 management track assessment. The SSC noted that there were some reductions in the spatial extent of abundance over time. Now, this is important, of course, because it could be due to one or both factors, one being climate-driven shifts, temperature changes, and so forth, or it could be due to overfishing historically, as Jason has described. However, despite all these apparent changes and so forth, there really isn't any sufficient basis to modify the existing ABC for 2025, and we recommend continuation of the ABC of 3,200 metric tons. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul. So again, 2025 would be the second year of multi-year specs. We'll have an assessment, as Paul mentioned, in 25. And so there's no action needed. I will flag, as mentioned in the brief materials, that Canada did expand their allowable landings in 24. Doesn't seem like we have to react immediately to that, but if they continue to increase landings, their anticipated landings come off the top. So that could really complicate future years, like next year's specifications. If our ABC stays low and their allowed landings increase, it could leave us in a tough spot. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. Any questions, comments for Jason or Paul? Michelle?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Jason. When did Canada take specific action to, expand that bait harvest? Was that end of last year or earlier this year?
It was earlier this year, and then they shut it. So I think they will catch, I think it was about 450 metric tons roughly. So I anticipate that will be landed. Whether that we exceed our ABC will depend on our landings and rec, catch, and discards. So again, it's not clear, what the end result will be, but could definitely complicate future things.
And just to follow up, so, the allowance that we have in our specs for the Canadian bait harvest, that was based on what they had set previously. Is that correct, or just sort of on average catches?
It was on some of their landings in the context of them having basically shut their fishery down. And so, yeah, I anticipate actual Canadian landings will be higher than we set aside for this year.
Rich?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've just noticed that the rebuilding target F is 0.07. Is that correct? And is that that's extremely low? Could you walk us through why that F is so low? I don't think I've ever seen a target F that low. Thank you.
I think our target overfishing that first spiny dogfish might be 0.02, just for like standard operating procedure. I think it's just real. So I'd have to talk to Kirsten, double check. I think just when you look at the recruitment that's putting in and where we're starting at quite low in order to rebuild, that was just the F that got us rebuilt in 10 years with that 60% probability. So it's probably a tiny bit higher if you were going to go with a coin flip probability of rebuilding in 10 years. But I think it's just, given how low we're starting and where the assessment thinks we need to go combined with the anticipated recruitment.
So is that a F based on MSY or is that a proxy for MSY? Do you know?
So that's just like a rebuilding F. So it's so it's not, there's like the I think it's a proxy FMSY once we are rebuilt to kind of harvest MSY, but this is just like a rebuilding F of, fish in, fish out, getting to a target.
Paul Rego.
Yeah, thanks. Just to add to Jason's explanation, of course, it is a function of the target probability of rebuilding and the target that you're going towards. For Atlantic mackerel, it's a little more complicated because there's a two-stage recruitment model that's used, and basically the first stage of that is that when stock sizes are low, you expect a lower set of potential recruitments that might occur. When the stock size increases above a threshold, then there's a much wider range of possible recruitments. Now that is based on examination of the historical data. What we would anticipate is that if those future stocks recruitments are possible when the stock size is large, then we should see a rapid recovery. Now, of course, that begs the question, is this due to an environmental effect or not? We don't know at this point, and so that will be undoubtedly a subject of considerable debate when we get back to the management track assessment. But for now, everything is conditioned on trying to get the spawning stock biomass up to a sufficient level such that we anticipate getting those large year classes that Jason had a very nice graphic of how that trajectory's changed over time. So thanks. Hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that was very helpful. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, I just had a question for Jason because Jason, I've heard you say this a couple times that our understanding of mackerel has changed substantially, and I think your comment was that the 1997 ABC was 10 times higher than what we now believe the entire SSB was that year.
Yes,
but I'm trying to reconcile that with catch because while it wasn't fully utilizing the quota, the fishery caught like 20% of the quota that year, which would be more than the entire SSB, and yet catches were relatively stable and then increased for a period of time after that. So I'm just trying to reconcile that, what seems like a bit of a disconnect.
Yeah, I mean, through much of the history, we were not catching the potential quotas. In terms of the catch in that year related to the SSB, I mean, it's possible they're catching a lot of small fish too that weren't in the SSB calculation. So I'd have to go back and look at that particular year and the catch and the F. It may have been a sky high F in that year also, but so in terms of the F in that year, I'd have to dig into that. But I mean, when you look at what the assessment was kicking out of what we could catch versus what we now think the SSB was in that year, that's the ratio. And just a follow up to Rich, once we're rebuilt, it's a 40% FMSY proxy of 0.21 is the current estimate for that. Thanks.
Any other questions? Go ahead, Bobby.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is more of a comment than a question. It's just to kind of echo what I said last year. Looking at the numbers, I don't know of any management plan that we have that is this skewed between what the recreational and the commercial quota is. I understand that we're held to these numbers and it is what it is, but the recreational is almost 3 times higher than the directed fishery. And if that sets a precedent going down the road, it's not going to be good for business. But I just want to highlight that fact that that's a pretty big discrepancy in the way that the quota is shared out. Jason.
Yeah, and I think the precedent of the plan is just deducting the expected recreational catch. So if and when it rebuilds, it's not like they would continue to get the same proportion of available catch.
Anything else for Jason on this? Jeff Kalen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, members of the council. I'm Jeff Kalen with Lund's Fisheries. I remember when the quota was 300,000 tons. So that was quite a while ago. We had a 200,000 ton herring quota at the time when the Americanization of the fishery was occurring. And what I wanted to talk about was some science that's going on right now that we're working with the cooperative research people, with Anna and Jeff Dasuti. With the Americanization of the fishery came the technology that is our midwater trawl fleet, and those boats have scientific grade sounders on them. Mike Jack from the center is part of this process, but what's being envisioned is that these our machines on the boat could actually survey mackerel in real time, because we all know that the pelagics aren't sampled well in the regular Bigelow trawl surveys. So, and our Science Center for Marine Fisheries, which some of you have heard about over the years, our NSF Industry University Cooperative Research Center, we're going to be funding an initial project to support that later this fall, or later this month actually, to do some AI evaluation of the data that will, translate what you're seeing on the machines to biomass that is available to the boat or in the region, and that there'll be some kind of jigging to take sampling when the project gets up and running. I think there's an internal request for almost $1 million for this project, which is way beyond our SEMFISH budget, but it's a pretty cool project, and utilizing the technology that the industry has invested in over time to try to get a better picture of what's out there. And this is sort of in line with the whole idea of industry surveys ultimately and so forth. So I just thought I'd mention that that's ongoing to the council, just so you're aware of some of the thinking that's occurring there. Thank you.
Megan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Megan Lapp-Seafries. I just want to echo what Bobby Rule mentioned about the discrepancy between the commercial and recreational harvests. We just had the discussion about, if Canada continues increasing its catch, what are we going to deduct? And I think it's very important that we deduct that, not just from the commercial industry, because we're starting out the year at an incidental limit. We're not going to be able to direct at all. We've essentially closed the fishery and we are held to an incidental limit. But the recreational fishery is not receiving that same treatment, and recreational catch is going to be 3 times higher than the directed commercial catch in a high tonnage commercial fishery. And in my opinion, that's something that we're going to have a very serious discussion about, because if everybody gets cut and everybody starts out at an incidental limit, everybody gets cut. Thank you.
Jason.
Yeah, the recreational catch aspect of it has been tricky as the council has moved into annual catch limits. Most of the recreational catch, I believe I'd have to double check, but I'm pretty sure is in state waters, which so the states, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine, I think put in 20 fish per person trip limits was the first kind of trip limit that we had on the rec side as part of the rebuilding plan. But ultimately, the council can't impact much of the recreational catch directly because it's in state waters. So whether to directly control that recreational catch much beyond what it is currently with that 20 fish limit, and the states essentially volunteering to go along with that would either require continued state cooperation or working through the commission somehow or something if there's because again it's most of the catches in state waters, so the council doesn't have direct control over it.
Bobby. Refresh my memory, Jason. What is the actual what are the regulations for recreational in the EEZ?
It's a 20 fish per person possession limit.
Any more questions or comments? All right, seeing none. Thank you, Jason. Let's move on to Chris Moore. Does anybody want to make any changes to the 2025 specifications? Seeing none, they will stay the same. Let's move on now to the 2025-2026 butterfish specs. Jason.
Thank you. We'll get that presentation up in a minute. Okay, so we had a butterfish assessment in 2024. So the council is looking to adopt 25 and 26 specifications. We'll talk a bit about this assessment and stock status, the current primary measures, the fishery information document, and AP report. Paul will provide a summary of the SSC recommendation, have some input from the monitoring committee. And again, council is looking for 25 and 26 specifications as an outcome. Same acronyms here. I won't repeat them, but you'll see them pop up frequently. So overall assessment, we had a 2024 management track assessment. It's a WAM model, continues to be used for butterfish, not overfished or experiencing overfishing. It's also really unclear what would cause overfishing for butterfish. And Paul will talk a bit about that a little bit later. This is the assessment and stock status. You can see it's well above the middle dashed line is the overfish threshold, the target at the top, so well above the target. Our current primary measures, we have limited access. There's 3-inch mesh if more than 5,000 pounds of butterfish is being possessed. There's a substantial discard set aside. Both there's a cap that can close the longfin squid fishery. We also set aside just discards that could occur in other fisheries. There's a slowdown if the directed fishery approaches 1,000 metric tons of the quota, then it goes to 5,000 pounds per trip. And the 2024 quota is just a bit below 10,000 metric tons. Just a sense from the assessment of commercial landings and commercial discards, there's minimal recreational catch. And you can see discards can comprise a substantial portion of the catch in most years. Prices have been, fairly consistent last decade. Some interannual trends. I mean, some interannual variability, but not a huge trend in the last decade. The landings and revenues since '96, the revenues mostly tracking landings. You won't see the Butterfish quota monitoring report on the NIMS website. I don't know, maybe a decade ago, some of the industry was thought that the real-time landings were giving some overseas buyers some leverage over them. They requested Garfo discontinue the weekly landings monitoring to avoid that. The fishery performance report 23 saw a bit more effort towards butterfish. Longfin prices were low. The AP continues to note that and I'm blanking on the official name of it, but the Northeast Monument creates some negative effect for butterfish fishing, both as kind of a fence effect if they want to go beyond it in the winter, it's an extra run, or also they used to land butterfish in that area, from that area. Continue concern that while things seem to be okay now, it's a potential choke species for longfin squid fishing, and they've long raised questions about whether the current mesh was appropriate or not. And I'll go to Paul for his butterfish SSC summary.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Yeah, as Jason intimated, butterfish is one of the more difficult species to assess, despite the fact that we do have a very high-end model used in the assessment. But as the management track suggests, the stock is well above BMSY and likely fish, but these depend upon two interrelated estimates. One is natural mortality, and the second is survey catchability. Now, both of these factors are primary determinants of stock size, and they induce a lot of uncertainty, especially in this FMSY proxy. So I'd like to give you a little bit of background on how what I mean by those statements. So the next slide, please. Talk about the process. Now, normally in a stock assessment model, you can't estimate both your natural mortality rate, M, and V, your catchability in the same model. Their effects are compounded. So normally what we do is assume M based on some aspects of life history, and then M, and then the catchability is estimated in the model. However, in this case, we have the benefit of a lot of groundbreaking work that John Manderson did, others at the center, in terms of defining habitat for butterfish, and we also have some cooperative fishing experiments. Now, the habitat work suggested that the stock and was much larger than what we sampled in the survey, and so that offshore component of that survey habitat volume was quite substantial, and we weren't hitting it. And then we also had cooperative research work on the bottom trawl survey, which again established some empirical evidence as to what the catchability was. So once we had that empirical estimates of catchability from the oceanographic data and from the experimental trawl data, we were able to fix that value and estimate M. So which was a significant advance. However, this M poses some issues, and I'll next slide, please. Now, when V is the catchability, there we go. Thank you. It comes out to a natural mortality rate of about 1.3 per year. Now, to give you some idea what that means, it's about 72% of the stock or cohort dies each year, and within 4 years, you have about 99% dying due to natural mortality. So this is quite high, and not we don't see estimates of natural mortality that high, except for generally like squid and so forth, which live very short lifespans. So when you plug in that very high M and you use the very low catchabilities, you get a large stock size because you need a lot of fish to support the observed catch. And when you go through the exercise, you get an FMSY proxy equal to 5.1. That's pretty much you know a 0% chance of making it to H5. So next slide, please. So consistent with previous management track assessments and consistent with previous peer review about the value of M and the observed value of FMSY proxy equal to 5.1, the SSE substituted an alternative estimate of FMSY equal to 2/3 M. Now this is justified in the literature. There are a number of other pelagic stocks for which this this measure is used, and this brings the FMSY value down to 0.82. Now that FMSY proxy is applied to the age-specific selectivities estimated in the model too. So just we need to keep that in mind, that the scalar is not an exact determinant of the force of mortality across all age classes. So what this does is reduce the magnitude of the projected catches, and we think it's more consistent with the ecological properties for forage fish. And we really benefited from scholars like Ed Hood, which I'll mention tomorrow, and that his perspectives on it. So in light of these uncertainties and the consequences for model stability, that is, you don't really know where you are at a given point in time, with a lot of certainty. We used an OFLCV of 100%, 150%, excuse me, and that leads to the recommendation for ABCs of 17,000 metric tons in 2025 and almost 14,000 metric tons in 2026. So thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Paul. And I'll note this also creates like a slight kind of an interesting situation where National Marine Fisheries Service has an accepted assessment with an FMSY of 5.1. So like in their national stock status documents, you'll see that 5.1. So we've maintained that 5.1 in our stock status documents in the briefing book. So there's a little discordance there, but it is what it is. So Paul gave you the why there. So again, the SSC stuck with its 2/3 natural mortality approach, increased the CV, and just again summarizing the ABCs that you get with those calculations. So the monitoring committee met, and we consider what's happened recently with discards, primarily here, of what could be set asides that would avoid ACL overages, to avoid paybacks. The longfin discard cap here has been set at 3,884 metric tons by the council for a number of years. The longfin squid fishery has kind of lived within that and not been shut down with that, and not been at high risk of getting shut down with that. There is no information to suggest changes to that to the monitoring committee, but the council could potentially change that if it wanted to. We monitoring committee thought that taking the 18 to 23 average plus a standard deviation for assumed other discards should again make sure that the other discards that are occurring in other fisheries aren't unexpectedly higher than assumed and result in annual catch limit overages. And so when you subtract those out, you get a quota, or DAH, or domestic annual harvest, of a bit above 11,000 metric tons in 2025 and 8,000 metric tons in 2026. The other change discussed by the monitoring committee is previously we had this fishery had a 5% set aside for a management uncertainty buffer. But given the setup for discards and recent performance of the fishery, it didn't seem like there was a high risk of overages. So why put 5% potential quota on the shelf? The other issue I'll flag is there was a letter from Captain Glenn Goodwin noting that there had been some work suggesting that 8 centimeter T90 mesh, which is just diamond mesh hung sideways, or 8 centimeter square mesh, looks like it has about as good performance as our current rules for releasing small butterfish. Now, those rules were based on a pound net study of 2 5/8 inch that we bumped up a little bit because we know that diamond mesh is going to compress, and some input from advisors that they could probably live with 3-inch mesh. When the directed butterfish fishery was reestablished, we didn't have a ton of information of what to set a minimum mesh at. We know it'd probably be good to release some small butterfish. We had this ancillary study suggesting we'd get some release of small butterfish with 3-inch mesh. So that's how it was set up initially. Cornell had done some work that suggested that 8 centimeters, which is a bit more than 3-inch, but that's a knot to knot measurement. The inside stretch is a bit less, would actually also release small butterfish. And the staff also recommends allowing the use of that. It seems like it will perform just as well as the current mesh, allow industry a bit more flexibility to try to use that mesh to target butterfish. And the justification for that seems at least as good as the justification for the current mesh. The diamond versus square is already collected in the observer program and discussed with the observer program that they should be able to work with their observers to note when they're using that T90, the diamond mesh hung sideways. So then we could examine its performance in the future. So again, this is just a summary slide. I think the service has some potential enforcement concerns about the mesh that they'll raise, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Any questions or comments for Jason or Paul? Richard?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Paul. I'm fascinated by this question about the natural mortality. And as you guys have, readily acknowledged, that's a huge, misspecifying M has profound impacts on the outputs of the assessment. I'm just curious about that M of 1.3, I think you said does that jive with its life history? For example, longevity is simple function of M. Do you see what's the maximum age for this species? I don't really know much about butterfish. And do you see a fish, older than 4, because that, 1.3 would basically kill everything off before it gets to 4 years old. So I'm just curious about that. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't have like the age comp plots handy, but yeah, you see very few fish older than age 4 in the assessment. But I'd have to follow up online. I can get you some of the age plots from the assessment.
Any more questions, comments? Mike Penny.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, Jason hinted at this. I think in terms of the recommendation to change the minimum mesh size regulations, I think that's a fair topic to study, but I would just suggest that before the council take final action on that it run it through its enforcement committee, so that we can make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of ensuring that our regulations are enforceable, that the gear can be observed at sea and measured, and everybody has the same opportunity to use whichever gear they would prefer.
Bobby? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to that point, I just want to point out that the T90 is not new. It's currently used in ground fish specs. And it is an easily identifiable mesh type. So I don't foresee it being an issue as far as being able to identify correctly. It's not like we're presenting a new type of gear that hasn't been seen. This is stuff that has been used before and is currently being used. So I don't foresee it being an issue for identification. Mike?
Yeah, I'm getting very different feedback from our enforcement team. They do have concerns, and they would like an opportunity to make sure that this runs through the enforcement committee before any final action is taken. They have some concerns about it being, something that the Coast Guard can easily identify.
Michelle?
So I just looked, and this isn't in the draft list of items for our 2025 implementation plan. So assume that it would need to be placed on there in order for this evaluation and feedback from the enforcement committee would need to occur.
Jason?
So the mesh is, I think, again, similar to what's used. The tricky thing is for enforcement, they have to know that if this diamond mesh is hung sideways, then there's a different limit, 2 5/8, than if it's not hung sideways, 3 inch. I think that would potentially be the tricky thing. And my understanding is that it actually has to be hung sideways, so it's clear both on deck and on a reel, if that's the case. Now, we have rollover in specifications. These really aren't changing in an appreciable fashion. Oftentimes, mackerel, squid, butterfish specifications aren't implemented until the middle of the year anyway. I could see a couple of options for the council. Council could just, move forward with the basic specifications here. Potentially, staff would work on the NEPA documentation. I don't know if there's time to look at this in December and then just fold it into the specifications versus a totally separate action next year. It seems like it's just mostly going to have to, it would be what it is. It seems like it'd be more like an kind of outreach and education for the enforcement personnel of exactly what this looks like. This wouldn't be implemented for probably 4 to 6 months anyway, even under normal timeline. So even if the council just put it in specs, it seems like there'd be a good amount of time for folks to get up to speed on what this looks like. But if it's a major concern, potentially the council could just have this be an item in December without creating an entire new action.
Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just so everyone understands exactly what you're proposing, Jason. We understand that the science behind this mesh is figured out. We don't have to. We're not worried about the mesh being too big or too small. It works, right? So is the question then more of an enforcement issue because we're reconfiguring the way that this mesh appears in the net, and as such, therefore, we have some Garfield enforcement folks that are worried about that part of it. If it's only that, having a review prior to our December meeting to confirm that in fact what you're proposing is fine would work. That's if I understand it correctly.
I would say the science for using the proposed change is at least as good as the science backing up the current mesh regulation. The work Cornell did was a pilot project. There was discussion in their report of expanding it beyond the pilot work, but there's also other published research that indicates the better selectivity of square mesh or mesh hung square separate from Cornell's work. So I think especially given when you consider the science of behind the current mesh regulation. From my perspective, the enforcement issue would be the primary issue.
Mike Penny.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to follow up on that. The science, I think, is not sound. I mean, it's not unsound, but it's, as Jason said, it's one, pilot study. I think it's one vessel, 3 trips. Maybe that's as good as what the original decision back in the day was, but it's not like there's a wealth of validated science that's demonstrated the effectiveness of this gear. That's not to say it's not worth pursuing. I feel the council has an enforcement committee for a reason. I think this is an ideal thing for the enforcement committee to review and discuss and give a recommendation on.
Anna.
Would this be an opportunity for an exempted fishing permit of some sort?
Mike.
Yeah, I mean, if Cornell wanted to expand the study from the original pilot study and get some more vessels using it, we'd be happy to entertain an EFP.
Chris.
So I think we're back to what do we want to do with this prior to maybe December, our December meeting. So if we think about what Jason said in terms of his proposal, having the enforcement committee meet before our December meeting just to go over what we have in front of us today and confirm or indicate that there's going to be a potential problem would be something that we could then talk about again at the December council meeting, and then thumbs up or thumbs down relative to whether or not we want to make those changes to the regulations or propose those changes to the regulations. So that's very doable. If that's what we're talking about. Does that work?
Yeah, given the concerns I'm hearing, that seems like a path forward.
Okay, so if everyone agrees, that's what we'll do. We'll have an enforcement committee meeting sometime in, I don't know, November, and bring that to the council.
All right, with that, I guess we'll do everything in December, unless we want to go ahead and we want to adopt the 2025 and 2025 or 2025 and 2026 specs now, and then we'll move on to the mesh later. Peter.
So that sounds like the preferred path forward. Let's adopt the specs if we get consensus around the table, and then look at the enforcement issues in December at the December meeting. So then I have one motion for today. If I could ask for somebody to put it on the board. I have one that was emailed to me, but sometimes the board has some different words. Okay. I move that the council adopt 2025, 2026 butterfish specifications as shown in the table below that result in quotas DAH of 11,324 metric tons in 2025 and 8,051 metric tons in 2026. And if you'd like, I can read that giant table line by line, but that's up to you. It is referenced in the motion.
Yes, it is. Do we have a second on the motion? Bobby Roll. Any further discussion on the motion? I don't think we need any rationale, but Peter, would you like to add any? Okay, Bobby. Are there any objections to the motion? Any abstentions from the motion? Motion passes unanimously. And Peter.
And I would just say that I'll probably be bringing a motion forward at the December council in regards to this enforcement discussion we're having. So thank you.
Okay, so we have another December agenda item now. Anything else, Jason?
Not for butterfish, thank you.
All right, before we continue on with the Jason Didden show, let's Let's take about a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 10:10 and do spiny dogfish.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Let's move on to the 2025 spiny dogfish specifications. Jason?
Thank you. So this is a review of multi-year specifications, but we do have a new ABC from the SSC, so some action is likely needed. I will spend a little time on the assessment here, go through a similar path as previous, some fishery performance information. Paul will provide some input on the ABC, summarize input from the monitoring committee, and then the Spiny Dogfish Joint Committee. Same acronyms as before. Again, the SSC sets the ABC that the council cannot exceed, and I've got some metric tons to pound conversions up there. Okay, so a little background on the assessment. The biomass unit is pups, and so at the end, on the far right, the assessment is estimating 191 million pups produced. It's just about at the target level, although it's down a good bit historically. So the assessment thinks that the productivity of the stock is less, and then if we stayed about where we are, that's optimal. Before we had this assessment within the last few years, we were basically just relying on the survey. But now we have an actual assessment model. It's incorporating landings and discards in the surveys, and critically the sizes of the fish in all of those data streams, and information about biology and growth in the stock to model the stock, rather than just relying on the survey. And with, I think any assessment, the historic trends are more certain. Where we want to go and what we're going to see in the future is always inherently more uncertain. With dogfish, perhaps especially so, because we have a good bit of an uncertainty about their growth, and that makes both our target for biomass and our projections more uncertain. And again, kind of emphasizing that it's not just the survey we're dealing with here anymore. These are a number of trends of the size of fish in a few of the data streams, including landings, discards, and the survey. And you see a pretty consistent trend here. As the directed fishery spun up, it was driven down. In the 2000s, when landings were really restricted, we started to see more of those 90 centimeter plus females. But then it seems like we probably set the ABCs too high, and we started to erode the proportion of those biggest female fish that are the most productive fish that we see in all the data streams. Again, not just survey, but in landings and discards. This was not used in the model, but I thought was a neat output in the research track assessment. Andy Jones and a few of us in that research track assessment looked at, created a CPUE from observer and study fleet data, so bottom trawl. And he kind of uses he looks at species that are commonly occur with spiny dogfish, uses that as a trip identifier, and then looks at the CPUE in those trips. So these are bottom trawl trips, so it's not a directed fishery CPUE, but it was pretty interesting that if you look at the upper two left, which were kind of a couple different ways to group the species, versus the bottom right, the survey, very similar trends in the observer and study fleet data as we saw in the survey. Another thing that's kind of come up in some of these meetings is like, it's impossible. The assessment is saying that there's almost no spiny dogfish. There are lots of spiny dogfish, but the assessment doesn't say that there are almost no spiny dogfish. And I think this graph is one that creates a little trouble because it's got a funny axis there. You can see the axis labels are, 4, 6e to the 05. And the bottom is not 0, it's 3e to the 05. And so that bottom is not 0, it's 300,000 metric tons. And like the The assessments, they use a lot of auto-generated graphs, and I think this one creates a lot of confusion. So when you look at the A and the B, this is total biomass of males and females. It looks like it's almost near like the bottom axis. But if you add A and B together, you're at 728,000 metric tons or 1.6 billion pounds of spiny dogfish. This is not pups. This is not, you know, mature females. This is total biomass males and females. So just wanted to kind of note that it's not like the assessment is saying that there are no spiny dogfish out there, just that there are less spiny dogfish out there. We did get one survey data update. It was up a bit in 23 and 24. There wasn't a survey in 23 that could be used for spiny dogfish. So whether it's the start of an increase or just part of the overall downward trend in the survey, we won't find out for a few years. This is a pup index. It isn't an index that goes directly into the assessment, but it's still calculated. There are a few statements made across a few of the preceding meetings that the pup index had been high. So there was a period in like 2011, 12, 13-ish where it was high, but the most recent years, the pup index has also been low. So again, assessment overview. So we're at the target, but the assessment sees lower annual productivity, mostly due to fewer of those biggest females, not none, but fewer. We see that across data sources, not just a survey. And the assessment indicates that with the current productivity, we'd expect ABCs, allowable catches, around 7,500 metric tons permanently, but again, harkening back to that uncertainty about growth, projecting where we go forward is inherently more uncertain. Okay, so that's a little assessment background. In terms of fishery performance, again, this is just starting from 2000 when the FMP started. You can see it was kept very low initially. Then the quotas were increased based on the assessment at that time. The fishery kept up with it for a bit, but then has been trailing off in the last decade. Prices in recent years have been pretty stable. And again, this is all inflation adjusted to 2023 dollars. This is, it's a fishing year, so it starts May 1. Orange here is the 2023 fishing year. The blue is the 2024 fishing year through a week or two ago. We get some late state reports. It varies the lateness by state. So we tend to get maybe a bit more changes late in the in the reporting cycle for spiny dogfish compared to at least some of the other species I deal with. The advisory panel input was pretty similar to previous years, flagging that they see a lot of factors that influence participation in landings. They don't see, from their experience on the water, a lot of the abundance trend changes that we see in the assessment, and flag that it's a tenuous fishery where interest in fishermen for spiny dogfish are a danger of going away, noting kind of continued erosion of vessel participation in recent years. And they indicate that the kind of yo-yo we've been in with spiny dogfish has exacerbated the situation, and that there's really most of the dogfish are processed at one processor, and if quotas are low enough that processor decides it's just not worth it anymore, that will really destroy this fishery. They also continue to flag that performance issues, whether it's starting at different times or not completing all stations, is a major problem for this and other fisheries. They also provide a variety of research ideas that will feed into the council's research process. So the ABC, Paul will give a summary, but I'll just note for so your risk policy for a species just above the target, you've told the SSC to give you about a 54% chance of not overfishing. So to achieve that little 4% higher chance. And a coin flip of not overfishing, it's about an 8% cutback from the overfishing level. That translates into about 600 metric tons per year of buffer to achieve that slightly better than coin flip chance of not overfishing. So we did, projections were redone. There was an error in the 2022 discards based on the discard mortality rate that was applied to some of the trawl fisheries. We also now have 2023 data versus just the projected assumed 2023 data. We have the higher 2024 ABC that NOAA implemented. So it didn't change the biomass much, a little bit, but it did have an impact on the ABCs that Paul will talk about next.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jason. Yeah, so as Jason described, the error in the dead discards for 2022 was an increase of about 41%. That lowers the starting condition that was previously thought to be slightly higher. And the 2024 projections were conditioned on that assumed catch being on the order of 7,800 metric tons. But the realized catch was actually 9,456 metric tons, or about 21% higher than expected. And then finally, the other change is that when the ABC was set to 7818, that alters the assumptions that were used to derive that original set of ABC estimates of 7,312 for 2025. So combined, those changes, next slide please, led the SSC to consider an alternative set of projections that adjusted for that. Now, this is something that we don't often do, it is something that we did with a great deal of discussion and concern, and I'll talk about those in a moment there. But for the starting points here, the ABCs for 25 and 26 are listed in the table. There are 7,031 and 7,446 for 2026. Next slide, please. The SSC acknowledged the concerns of industry and the reductions in the number of fishermen and processors, the higher costs, the concerns of the fragility of the international markets, and the consequences of the changes in the quota. However, we did recognize that our primary scientific responsibility as an SSC is to provide that acceptable biological catch. So currently, economic and social concerns under the present guidelines cannot be used to justify ABCs that lead to overfishing. And as Jason indicated, that margin between the ABC and the overfishing limit is pretty small under the current council risk policy. So next slide, please. So the ABCs, or the SSC, suggested an alternative, which was to use a 2-year average of the year-specific ABCs, and so either one of these scenarios would be acceptable in the scientific context and consistent with the modeling estimates. So the time-varying ones are 7,031 and 7,446 for 25 and 26. You get an average which is slightly less than the average of those two values because of the mathematics of how you take it out early, you don't get to take all of it back in the next go around. So it ends up being 7,230 metric tons. And both of these are consistent with the council's risk policy. I might add that in the SSC report, there is a typo. It's on page 3, and there's about the fourth paragraph down, but I refer to the 2024 catch of 9,456. It's actually the 2023 catch. So I apologize for that error and if it caused any confusion. So anyhow, it should be 2023 catch as opposed to 2024 catch in that paragraph. So and thank you for your time. Jason, back to you.
Thank you. And so I'll note that the monitoring committee and committee discussions have all focused on that averaged amount, 7,230 metric tons. Accounts, we could do some recalculation on the fly of the two separate ones, but given that mitigates the reduction in the first year and all the concerns about stability, all the numbers that you saw in the briefing book are based on that 7,230. Which are again summarized here, and I will keep moving forward. I'll just flag that. So if the council does go with that, the committee meeting and the council meeting we're focused on 2025. So just be looking to set for 2025 at this point. But the SSC has provided that same 7,230 for both years, 25 and 26. So that'd be the starting point at next year that the council would have to take up again. That information went to the monitoring committee. These slides are pretty similar to last year's. This trade-off between maximizing the limited quota versus avoiding ACL overages if you kind of are on the knife edge too much and get like what we had this year. That in 2022 there was an 2023 there's an overage that's being paid back now with a bit over £1 million deduction for the 2024 fishing year. Doesn't look like it will impact landings much because of just the trends in the fishery so far, but it was a good example of how that under specification of discards led to a deduction. And so since we can't ensure a zero risk of a big discard estimate causing a big annual catch limit overage and pound for pound payback without really severe buffers or really conservative set asides for discards, the approach of the monitoring committee has been to, a good faith effort to try to predict the discards as well as possible and avoid substantial overages in a typical year with the understanding that we can always have an atypical year too. Canadian discard and recreational landings discards are pretty simple. They're small amounts. The management uncertainty buffer and discards are where things are more complicated. This is just a graph of discards in recent years. I highlighted some of those top amounts. So, within the last decade or two, we've had discard amounts that are the same as our entire ABC. So just kind of highlighting the risk of high discard amounts. Now, I think there were more spiny dogfish then also, but if it wasn't that long ago. So just kind of it really drives home the point of the potential impact of discards. So where do those discards come from? In recent years, about 800 to 1,000 metric tons is from recreational discards. And then on the commercial side, it's both small mesh and large mesh, mid-Atlantic trawl, and both large mesh and small mesh New England otter trawl are the vast majority of the discards. The rest is a mix of some of the directed gillnet fishery and other gear types. But most of those discards are coming in trawl fisheries. The monitoring committee and the committee were kind of requested some additional digging into this question. Asked the folks at Garfo to if they could just bin landings for us to try to get a little more information on where they're coming from, divided Mid-Atlantic, Southern New England, and kind of Gulf of Maine or Northern New England into those three areas on that map. And that resulted in this table, which, okay, so we've got Gulf of Maine, Southern New England, and Mid-Atlantic on there. And then I circled kind of the 22 to 23 jumps we saw both in Gulf of Maine and Southern New England that are, I mean, Mid-Atlantic were substantial also here, but just to get a sense of the large mesh trawl increases in 23 that we saw in terms of that that overage that we had. Okay, so the monitoring committee looked at this information and said, you know, the discards have been fairly stable the recent few years. Probably a 5-year average is pretty reasonable way to set aside an expected discard amount for next year. That average is 3,699 metric tons. However, again, we could still get overages with that. Not saying that guarantees no overages. Oops, come on. And so this is just that average and the red top line compared to the to the calculated CAMS discards last 5 years. So you can see it's, you know, it can be a bit off, but it's been fairly close in the last 5 years. So last year there was a lot of discussion about what to do with discards also. And what the service ended up doing was using an amount used in the assessment process. And I think it's more useful to consider it as like an imposed ratio method rather than something that the assessment is really thoughtfully outputting. I was just looking at this, what the assessment had to do was, you know, okay, how are we going to portion the ABC in future years? It looked at the terminal year ratio and then did some adjustments in biomass. So that's what went into the assessment, but it was really imposed upon the assessment in order to make the projections. So if you did that based on the 2022 ratio, we get 22,700 metric tons. Again, this approach was considered the best available science last year. However, it's a lot lower than the typical performance we've seen in recent years. I think would be associated with a lot higher annual catch limit overage and payback risk. And also that it's imposing a ratio on the ABC, which means that if the ABC went to 0, discards would go to 0, but we know that's not going to happen. So there's some intuitive issues with this imposed ratio method that was utilized last year. Also, the 2023 ratio is a good bit higher. 22 that we based things on last year, the service based things on last year was now 37%, but 23, that ratio bumped up to 52%. So it's good, you know, again, it's what the assessment kind of utilizes for projections, but it's problematic for those reasons. So, you know, if you use these two different approaches, the 5-year average for discards ends up with about 7.5 million for a quota. The 2022, the imposed ratio method with 2022, you end up with about 9.7 million pounds for a quota. So, you know, the monitoring committee really felt there's no good options here, given the likely impact on the fishery. There's not a lot of flexibility given the legal and regulatory requirements for the monitoring committee. Industry members on the monitoring committee and the public who attended the monitoring committee, you know, flagged that these resulting quotas are not viable for continued existence of the last processor and this fishery. The next assessment is scheduled for 2027, and they kind of flagged that, you know, waiting for the next assessment isn't going to help them out. So after a lot of discussion, the committees kind of came up with a blend, kind of flagging that, you know, there's some pros and cons to each of these approaches. When you're dealing with uncertainty, sometimes taking an average of two different approaches can be a reasonable way to go about it. That is what the committee recommended, and that results in a commercial quota of 8.6 million pounds. The committee also, let me just, okay, so they'll flag the committee also made a recommendation requesting the service take some emergency action to try to increase the quota also. That will come forward to you through the committee motions, and the rationales for both these specifications recommended by the committee and that emergency motion are in the briefing materials. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. Any questions or comments for Jason? Any questions from the audience? Comments from the audience? Anna?
Yes, thank you. Just so I'm clear, so even with the temporary rule going into effect, we still need to set specifications for 25 and 26. Is that correct? Or rather, at least 25.
Jason?
Yeah, so the service put in their interim rule for the 2024 fishing year, which they can only do it for 6 months, so I had to extend it. And so that will only cover until May 1, 2025, which is the 2024 specifications. So given the updated ABC from the SSC, the council, I think, needs to set something new for 2025. And then again, it wasn't noticed for 2026. Potentially it could continue on the same if the SSC endorses the same ABC next year. But for today, it's really just looking at 2025 fishing year.
Michelle, you're thinking.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of the same between a rock and a hard place that we were, you know, previously. And, you know, there's no great option, and there's no good solution. I mean, I'm not on the committee. I certainly support, you know, the discussion that the committee had, and, you know, the motion that they put forward to try to use, you know, a combination of these two approaches to address the discard issue.
Jason?
And if there are no clarifying questions, we can go to those committee motions.
Sonny? You can make the motion on behalf of the committee.
Stephen, could you zoom in a little bit so that table takes up a bit more of the screen on that Word document?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the council adopt revised 2025 spiny dogfish specs as shown in the table below.
I won't make you read the whole chart. Thank you. Discussion on the motion. Mike Penny.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. So Jason mentioned that there was a second motion from the committee that the council will consider, which is, I guess, going to be a request to the agency to take emergency action. And I almost feel like we should be discussing that motion too, because what I don't want to see happen is people adopting this motion pro forma with the expectation that it's irrelevant because there's going to be a motion to take emergency action. So I want people to understand the implications of that second motion. I guess before we fully act on this current motion, because I think it's important to understand the full playing field of what might happen. So I don't know procedurally if there's a way to do that, but just concerned that we dispense with this motion. Anyhow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Based on Mike's comment, I think we just decided maybe it's best to have that discussion regarding the other motion from the committee at this time. So procedurally, I think it would be okay to say I move to table this motion until after the council deliberates on the concept of the next motion, so we can have an open discussion about that before we take up the action.
And Jim Gilmore would like to second. Any more discussion on this, going with this? Yeah, sure we can. Okay. All right. So, all right, Sonny, then you want to bring up the next committee motion? Oh, that's right. Yeah, any objection to the, I'm gonna scroll back down, please. Any objection to the motion to table the council? Seeing none, let's move on then. You want to go ahead and read into the minutes, Sonny?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the council request NOAA Fisheries to take emergency action to allow a higher quota through any possible approach given concerns related to National Standard 8 of the Magnuson-Stevens Act.
Thank you, Sonny. Discussion on the motion. Mike.
So just as a reminder to everybody, I'll be voting to oppose the motion, as I always oppose motions for emergency action, just to preserve the Secretary's authority under the Magnuson Act. But in this case, I also have some concerns, and it's that I'm not really clear what the new and unexpected information is that would prompt emergency action. We also have a procedural issue, which is that we took emergency action for 2024 and we extended it. The Magnuson Act allows one extension of an emergency rule for a full year, does not provide for follow-on emergency actions for the same circumstances. So I think it's going to be incredibly difficult to justify, first of all, what the emergency is that was unprecedented and unknown to the council, that couldn't have been resolved through the specs process that we are going to take up in the next motion. And I also think procedurally that we don't even have the authority to do a follow-on emergency action, given that we did one for 2024. I'll stop there just to hear some more rationale on what the new circumstances are, unexpected circumstances are. But I can come back to this issue because I think there are some things that the council could have done that would have eliminated the need for this motion in terms of emergency action.
Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back to Mr. Pentney. I'd love to hear what we could have done differently. From your perspective, that would be helpful to know.
Mike Penny.
Well, I mean, if again, looking at the motion that's going to come up on the board, the OFL coming from the SSC is 16.8 million. There's no opportunity for us through emergency action to set an ABC higher than the OFL. That would result in overfishing. So the upper limit for any emergency action for us would be 16.8 million. The council could have given direction to their SSC to use a different risk policy to enable the SSC to give you an ABC equal to the OFL. The council still used the risk policy as Jason and Paul described for a 46% probability of overfishing or a 54% probability of not overfishing versus 50%. So the council effectively made a choice to apply a risk policy that's more risk averse than what it could have done. But now it's asking me to be less risk averse and set an ABC equal to the OFL, which the council could have done.
Jason.
I'll note that so council staff actually did recommend a higher ABC to the SSC, saying that on balance, with a slightly higher survey and all the uncertainty, that it didn't seem like it was necessary to change things. So the recommendation then went from council staff, but that really is not tweaking the risk policy. And I think the SSC said, we have the risk policy, we have this new information, we're considering it best available, we should use it because that's the council's risk policy. So it's just like a slight little nuance in that I just wanted to flag for someone kind of really delving through the briefing materials. But ultimately, yeah, the SSC stuck with the council's kind of risk policy as is.
Jason.
And I don't think that can be changed just through specifications to risk policy. I think that would need, I think it would need some other action. Like, well, I'm not sure. I'll just say I'm not sure how that risk policy can be changed.
Chris.
Yeah, I'd like to focus on that for a little bit, not to derail the conversation, but Paul, not to put you on the spot, but I'd like you to weigh in on that because that's an important point. What Mike Pentney just said would suggest that in fact the council has the ability to modify our risk policy at some point before decisions are made relative to, spiny dogfish or other species. And I really would like a response from you, Paul, regarding that.
Sure. Well, I think all of it really hinges on the sort of the binding aspect of the council's risk policy. The SSC assumes that it is a binding constraint on defining the ABC. So that's how we interpret it, and we do not take liberties with respect to suggesting alternative values for it. So if it could be, and I would just add that the policy itself was the result of a fairly extensive and I think exemplary set of management strategy evaluations that said, okay, yeah, for a suite of species, this particular risk policy does in fact provide a reasonable set of compromises associated with the challenge of trying to maintain and in some cases rebuild stocks to higher levels. And I think the council itself can kind of see that manifest in the sort of the overall status of stocks within the Mid-Atlantic, that for the most part they're doing reasonably well, but at any rate, so those are sort of the considerations that the SSC takes into account when it does it. That we don't take liberties with the aspects of the risk policy as defined, and we appreciate the fact that it has been supported by a broad range of simulation studies to validate its efficacy.
Mike Penny.
Thanks. And yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have expected the SSC on its own to deviate from the risk policy. I think, it's important to recognize the SSC works at the behest of the council, and the council developed and implemented the risk policy. And that's a reflection of the risk tolerance of the council under different circumstances. And so, I guess my position is it's totally within the purview of the council to direct the SSC to use a different risk policy and deviate from that, if circumstances warrant. And I guess the concern that I'm raising here is that the council did not choose to do that in giving its direction to the SSC, but is now at the same meeting saying we want the agency to deviate from our risk policy and adopt emergency regulations to set a higher quota. And the challenge is that under the Magnuson Act, we don't have the authority to do that. For things that the council could have addressed within its own normal process, that's not an emergency.
Mike, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was trying to figure out how this comment would be best stated. I completely understand. I think Michelle put it very simply at the beginning. We're between a rock and a hard place here, honestly. And I understand where the service sits and what Mike is saying about the council's. There was a possibility that the council could have considered and recommended something different to the SSC regarding its risk policy. However, I think so for me, and if there's a policy established, I'm not so certain that I would feel comfortable tweaking it only to achieve a desired outcome. That we spent years discussing and building and evaluating and conceptualizing a risk policy that the SSC uses. And I'm confident in the work that the council did at that time to establish that policy moving forward. And it just bothers me a little bit that, and I shouldn't be saying, I shouldn't say that. I'm just discouraged in the fact that the service, and I understand where they are in the rock and the hard place. I just don't know that if the council would have done something different and altered its risk policy, we might be getting conflicting messaging that this is not something that the council established a risk policy. You should stick to your policy. And I feel like depending on whatever situation we're in, the advice was going to be different. And maybe I'm wrong, but I'm not comfortable in trying to modify any of this now. And I realized, excuse me, that the service, we're being told, won't
cannot do what we're asking here based functionally, they wouldn't be able to accommodate the request here. So I'm not sure what we do at this point. I guess I would have to vote against the motion here, given what Mike's raised, and then we'll get back to the main motion and see what we can do with that. But that's where I am right now. A little frustrated, and but I think the council needs to stand behind its work that went into developing the risk policy that we're currently using. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Michelle?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with everything that Mike just laid out, and I appreciate the position that Mr. Pentney articulated with respect to sort of the bind that this motion will put the agency in. And there's not. I think it's also a matter of timing with respect to this information that came before the SSC and the committee. I don't know even if first of all, on principle, I agree with Mike. I don't think we should retroactively try to re-engineer a risk policy to achieve a desired outcome. That said, I don't know that there would have even been opportunity to thoughtfully consider, a request for use of a different risk policy. And I think if the council wants to entertain something like that, we need to have, considered discussion about just an overall, consideration of situations under which we would have a different risk policy would be applied. Previously, prior to the current risk policy, we had like a special species modification to the risk policy for species that had, different life histories. So I think, I'd rather see something like that where there's an opportunity to have a thorough discussion about circumstances or life histories under which an alternative risk policy would be applied. So, I find myself in the same place as Mike in terms of, feeling like I need to, like Mr. Luisi, vote against that motion. And again, just highlight that I don't know that timing would have allowed for that type of opportunity. Thank you.
Joe Grist.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There was a comment or question from the service earlier about what's changed. Discard estimates has changed. Implementation of the camps is coming here. We're now look at 2023 estimates that was shown in the chart and the documents that Jason provided. Trawl discards are way up in there within the 3 reasons. I did a little quick math, and of all the dead discards estimated for spiny dogfish across all 3 areas, 94% of it is related to the trawl fishery. And in 2 of those reasons, it was a significant upturn in that estimate. That is a change. In fact, the dead discard estimate from 2023 is almost equal to the motion that we have tabled right now for what we're trying to get for a catch for the industry. So that is part of the driving factor, and that was part of the discussion of what's leading to this. And do I have faith in that discard number? I don't. I don't think we know enough about it. As far as this issue with risk adverse, we're operating under the information and the guidance that we understood. And now we're being told we could have gone some totally different way. We're looking at an industry that is on the brink of closure. We're down to 1 processor. We have a limited number of operators out there who depend on this to operate in the winter for a livelihood. There isn't much else left. So I'm having a hard time with this from the standpoint of when I look at the National Standard 8, I think about communities. We're not overfish. We're not overfishing. Get the projections. It's like just putting another nail in the coffin for this just because. We've got to be able to do something else. There has to be a way to do something else. Otherwise, we're just turning the back on the very industry that we're supposed to be also trying to protect and keep going, which is if we start losing industries, what's the point of this council?
Tony Kearns.
I don't, if Mike has a response to Joe Grist, he could go in front of me, but I had a question for the service. In the commission's FMP, we have the ability to roll over quota from the previous year up to 5% of an individual state's quota or the region's quota. It doesn't get us to where we need to be, but it can get us about 600,000 more pounds. And I'm trying to figure out that if we allow for that to happen, then, and we don't have the exact same quotas, what would the service do? Is that something that if we make that recommendation, they can take into consideration or not? Because the commission will also be reconsidering the current year's quota at our meeting in a couple weeks.
Mike.
Yeah, unlike some of the other regulations and plans, such as black sea bass, there's no mention in the spiny dogfish regulations about considering the recommendations or decisions of the commission. There's just discussion of the two councils.
Jason.
So I think in practice, what would happen is that the service would close federal waters when the federal quota is caught, and then states could potentially still allow fishing in state waters, but that has the potential then to count as an ACL overage if landings are higher. So it potentially could provide a little buffering to some an industry in that first year. If they can fish in state waters, but then it just has the potential to negatively affect the next year if it causes an overage that gets subtracted.
Anna.
Thank you. Part of the discussions we had at the committee as well was that some of the sturgeon protections that are impacting the 5 1/4 mesh size are going to prevent some of the catching of these larger dogfish, which was new information. I'm obviously concerned, as Joe is, with where this is going. North Carolina has a very clear history on how this plays out, and I'm extraordinarily sensitive to the industry and recognizing that we have stock assessment coming up in 2027. That doesn't necessarily help us, but I also feel that we are between a rock and a hard place, and there really does need to be a path forward, because otherwise, how do we as a council take into consideration socioeconomic concerns? How do we take into consideration National Standard 8? There has to be a path forward when we have these such extreme situations where we're about to collapse an entire industry. There has to be a path forward that doesn't blow up our work and our policies and cycles through and put us into a sort of catch-22 situation. And I appreciate the SSC's discussions. I think they clearly put a lot of effort into their thoughts. They gave us some options. They discussed the perils of fishing at OFL. And I don't want to take away the effort that the SSC did, but we also sort of lay our hands on the table and look for a path forward that makes common sense, where we are not walking away from the industry and not causing the same distrust and distaste that the commercial fishermen, certainly in North Carolina, ended up with after our somewhat recent history with dogfish. Thank you.
Any more discussion around the table? Jason?
Yeah, I think the initial emergency action by NIMS, and I don't have time to look at the rule, but I think it was mostly driven by the lower quotas coming out of the assessment. If the council were to request, I think the rationale is more on the both kind of correction to the discard error and the apparent recent increases in the discard estimates, even after that error year. So it's tricky, like the solution, and I'm not sure, I don't think did the council request emergency action at the last specifications? I don't think so. So the service did that. So I don't know, to me, it seems like even though the solution is kind of similar, it is a different set of circumstances. One more a reaction to the assessment, this more a reaction to the discard estimates.
Mike Penny.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not really following the discard estimate argument as a rationale for increasing the quota. Because it suggests that if we got new information that discards were lower than previously estimated, and therefore we can increase the quota and not result in overfishing, that might make some sense. But it seems like the discard estimates are higher than previously expected, which emergency action would ordinarily drive the quota down to account for higher than expected or previously known discards. But ultimately, and I'm just reading the words of the motion, emergency action to allow a higher quota given concerns related to National Standard 8. That's the exact reason we took emergency action in 2024. So recall that, point number one for 2024 was we could not approve the council's recommended discard estimate under National Standard 2. Felt it didn't represent the best available science. Now, what we could have done is simply substituted the model-based approach that the monitoring committee recommended, which would have driven the quota down. And that would not have been an emergency rule. That would have just been implementing specifications with a lower quota. But we took emergency action because that lower quota gave us concerns about National Standard 8. So we set the ABC equal to the OFL due to National Standard 8 concerns to increase the quota. And that's exactly what you're asking me to do here in this motion. And that's the challenge, is we can't simply repeat an emergency rule year after year.
John? Yeah. Mr. Whiteside. State your name and organization.
Good morning, Attorney John Whiteside, representing C-Trade. I'm on the monitoring committee as well as on the AP. And respectfully, I think the facts are different, that the facts that the service had last year prior to initiating the emergency action sua sponte are different than what are presented today, that the service did not know that C-Trade was closed and did not buy in May or June of this year. And the reason for that was there was a changeover from one plant to another, so that this year's landings have been lower because you didn't buy for 2 months. As of last year's, as for the SSC, we can't get into a time machine and go backwards to have the council look at a different risk assessment to give it to the SSC before they met. At that SSC meeting that I participated in, the SSC did not take public comment before setting the OFL ABC. They didn't hear about females maturing earlier, or that the large females that are being landed are fatter, and as a result, the specifications of C-Trade to their customers has had to change. That there was a comment that was made earlier about the impact that sturgeon will have in 2025. there's also, that was not considered. The point that Jason made about or that came up of the 41% error, roughly 6 million pounds of discards that were discovered. And then that payback that's happening this year of 1 million to 1.5 million pounds that's going to take off this year's quota. What happens when there's another recalculation of this year's discards being applied that we're going to have a payback to next year? And so I'm here really pleading, as other people around the table are, to keep this TAL at a point where the sole processor can remain open year round and have those. The last estimate I had was 64 vessels, and that was in the 2023 fishing year, down from 282 10 years ago. Keep those 64 fishing in the winter months, and that having this go too low, and we are right on the edge here. I can't predict if they can do it or not, but we need everything that we can. So if there's a way to move the ABC to the OFL, that would get us the extra 1 million pounds, roughly, of the TAL, and that's something I would look for. So thank you.
Any more discussion? Joe?
I just want to make sure I've got this straight about the emergency action that was noted. This is where I'm looking for a correction. In the previous actions, the council didn't actually ask for emergency action, but the service is saying they had to take emergency action to implement the rule. And by taking that emergency action, that nullifies our ability to do so, ask for an emergency action now. Am I understanding, is it that simple?
Mike?
No, no. So I'll explain before. So the council submitted specifications last year. Councils, I should say, joint between the two, New England and Mid-Atlantic. Council submitted specifications that we could not approve because we believe the discard estimate was inappropriate, not best available science. Now, one path forward could have been we make the correction in the specifications rule and simply reduce the quota to account for the best available science at the time on discards. That would have reduced the quota further from what the council's recommended. We did not do that. Instead, based largely on testimony we heard at this council and at the New England Council about the needs of the industry and the concerns under National Standard 8 for the processor to stop buying product, we chose to do an emergency rule to accommodate the desire of what we heard during public testimony for a higher quota. We went as high as we could to set the ABC equal to the OFL and then applied the discard estimate to that. Because we chose to do that, we have effectively no authority remaining in the Magnuson Act to take further emergency action to address that concern.
Mike?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick follow-up on that, Mike. So how does this service, so if an action's needed and it's emergency, and I'm thinking of it just in terms of like, okay, your house catches on fire, but you can't put it out in a year. It's still burning. The issues are still there. They're still right in front of us as far as an industry and the concerns of collapsing of an industry. But there's no ability to, it's like you kind of walk away from the fire. And I get it if it's based on the law and it's based on on what you must do or what you cannot continue to do as far as an emergency action. I just think it's a challenge. You've identified an emergency and you've taken action, but the emergency hasn't been dealt with for the into the future to get us on a good path. It's challenging to hear that, knowing that there's little we can do now, and there's little that the service can do, and I wish we had more options available to us. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Michelle?
And I guess just a reminder, our discussion yesterday on the 2025 implementation plan, one of the tasks on there is a framework looking at discards, if I'm recalling correctly, like sorry, let me back that up. It is a framework looking at accountability measures. And so, considering different circumstances as we have done with other species with respect to, discards and other information and how that's considered in the application of accountability measures. So, that's unfortunately next year. It's not now.
John, did you have a response?
I do. Thank you, John Whiteside. I think if NOAA focuses and finds on that there are different facts as they've been presented, there's a different rationale for the emergency action. If we just focus solely on, well, it was last year and the fishery is still in trouble, well, then no, there is no difference. But if you go into what the facts are, look at the discard mortality rate in the CAMS model. It shows 50%, but we know that that's not possible. There are different gear types that have lower discard mortality rate. There are distinctions here. There are, in some cases, they're fine line distinctions, but they are different set of facts that can lead us to a different conclusion. That's it.
Seeing no more comments, I'm going to go ahead and bring this motion up to a vote. I think we're going to go ahead and raise our hand on the computer so we can see what the vote's going to be.
Are you taking public comments?
Yes, I didn't see your hand raised.
Oh, sorry. I didn't realize
Jared?
it's time for the public. Yeah, sorry. This is Jared Auerbach from Red's Best. Is now an okay time?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to plead from the industry side. So we unload dogfish primarily out of our facility in Chatham, Massachusetts. It is really way harder to run a seafood business now than it was even 2 years ago, but certainly 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Dogfish is sort of important to our business model, but it's also kind of the backbone to all these other species that we handle, right? So, I mean, one, if sea trade goes away, we're just done. So there's that. But even if sea trade is able to sort of hang on, if we get put in a position where we're limited on landings by quotas or whatever, you're well aware of all the negative impacts on the business side of dogfish. But just want to bring up how it affects our business, the fishermen we work with, but all these other fisheries, right? So having dogfish throughput at our facility there, we have multiple trucks, we have ice makers, we have vats, forklifts, pallet jacks, and we're also servicing the lobstermen in the harbor and the bluefin tuna fishermen and the cod fishermen and all the clammers around Cape Cod, right? So there's just like a whole economy that we need all these elements to pay our bills, which is almost impossible to do as it is. Fortunately, I wish that was not the case, but it is. And, as you know, things are getting picked off constantly, right? We lose this, we lose that, we lose that. Next thing you know, you look at your books and it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's like, oh, well, this thing's down as this thing's down as this is down as this. And dogfish would be, lower quota would be a lot more than a paper cut, and it would threaten that whole kind of economic system. So thanks for listening.
All right, thank you. Bob, are you online?
Yes, thank you, Bob Blaze. I'm the CEO of Sea Trade. Been in the industry, dogfish industry for 30+ years. As everyone knows, the last 10 years has been a definite struggle for the industry. We've gone from, maybe over a dozen processors decades ago to 4 in the last decade, down to 2, and we're the final one standing. Having, a TAL of 8.6 million or 7.5 million, it's not going to be a sustainable number where we'll be able to process year-round, keep our workers going, and we're just going to have to move on to something else. I'm fearful that once the last processor is gone, dogfish may multiply, create other problems, but to go back and try to compete back in the world markets, primarily Europe, is going to be a tall order to get back in the market. There's always other species that are relevant and that can take over for dogfish if it's gone. So we employ a lot of people in New Bedford, and it goes all the way out again to the vessels and the offloaders and so on and so forth, packaging companies, airlines, on and on and on. And we're dealing with a number here that's really not sustainable. One other note, I did learn something today that there's 300,000 metric tons of females in the water. I know coming from the scallop side of the business, we harvest, I believe, 20% of the biomass on scallops each year. In this case, we're talking about less than 3%. So it seems like such a low number that we're harvesting out of the biomass, that another million or 2 million pounds here should be achievable somehow.
Pierre?
Sorry, I couldn't unmute. Hi, Pierre, obviously work for Sea Trade. Many of you have heard me speak before. Again, the economic impact of this is going to be massive. John and I fought pretty hard for 10.1 or 10.3 last year with a bit of a warning that we weren't sure if QCP, who was producing dogfish, would be able to make it, and they weren't. So they shut down. Luckily, we have a CEO that holds this industry and this fishery, near and dear to his heart. So he said, all right, I'm going to give it a go. And we sunk, hundred thousands of dollars into a new facility, trying to run as lean as possible to be able to make the margins that we need to make with this little weight. And now we're talking about cutting it by another 1.5 million pounds. I think the writing was on the wall and QCP went out of business. Now we're trying to tell you again, the writing is on the wall and we're on the verge of going out of business without even getting our feet wet yet. So, I mean, I'm facing unemployment. I have 100 coworkers in this building that are facing unemployment. And then that's just, our small little factory in New Bedford. That's not accounting for the 200 commercial fishermen, down the East Coast. The 6 or 7 docks down the East Coast, all going to be out. As soon as we say we're done, everybody's going to throw in the towel. We're the last of a dying breed. I understand that, but this is kind of a, learned skill. Not a lot of people, or in fact, time has proven there's only a certain amount of people that can do it. So once we're out, I think that's going to be it. And again, as I've stated every time on these calls, what are we going to do in 3 to 5 years when the fishery does come back? Because Europe has already started to look for another solution and they're finding it. So they've opened up their fishery with this news. So we're battling already to sell this fish into Europe. Now, once we go out 100%, they're going to send out, 100, 200 more boats, and they'll be able to get their fish, no problem. They do prefer our species, yes, but they're going to fill the void. Once we're out, we don't have a chance to get back in. And I hope you really take that in consideration. And again, John and I warned everybody last year with the 10 million, we're not sure if QCP is going to stay open. They closed. Luckily, Bob grabbed the bull by the horns and said, okay, we're going to do it ourselves. As soon as we did that, now we're cutting the quota again. And we're telling you, there's a very high probability it's not going to work with this volume. Thank you for your time.
Jeff Young. Jeff, it looks like you're still muted on your end.
Am I here?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Jeff Young. I'm with AMT Bioproducts. I take the byproducts of what Sea Trade generates from dogfish. I started my career over 30 years ago with Sea Trade, so I'm intimately familiar with their economics. And I can tell you that they're not bluffing about two things. One is there is a great overhead cost for them staying open year round to service the industry. And I'm terrified at these numbers that they are going to just say the heck with it and pull the plug. And what happened back when the quotas were really low in the early 2000s was there was still some fish coming from the US into the German market for Schillerlocken, the belly flaps. But a lot of those customers took it off the menu, and it took a lot of years to build that back to where it is today. And if Sea Trade does pull the plug and this, biomass rebounds, it's going to be extremely hard to get that valuable product back onto menus in Germany, and it's going to be very difficult to come back. And if Sea Trade goes, my company goes, we only have 17 employees here, but we service hundreds of organic farms that rely on fish for a nitrogen source. It's really the only good nitrogen source they're allowed to use in organic farming, and that's it's going to be a real hit to a lot of farmers all across the United States. And it is hard to believe with just this size of the biomass how many farmers we are affecting in allowing them to be successful. So it has a wider impact here than just on New England fisheries, and I know that's not your purview to worry about. But I think that in terms of the science, there is enough question about the discards to possibly allow an avenue to, to make a decision based on that. One of the things that a couple of things I think about is I know the data's there, and I didn't have the chance to ask Jason to look at, in discards, the rate of males versus females. Um, just anecdotally, when I've been called in with fish, boats accidentally get a large bycatch, and I've had a chance to look at it, it's almost always males, but that's just an anecdotal observation on my part. And I'm sure Jason has those numbers. I just didn't see them. But the other thing, a couple of things that came out of the data for me is looking at a high mortality rate in the past equaled a higher biomass. If you look at the mortality rates or the discard rate, excuse me, of boats back in the 2014, 2015 catch years, it was very high, which was indicative of a higher biomass. And when I see a change in the discard rate now, it does raise a question for me is that some sort of indication of increase in biomass? And also, I am very curious about those that pup index from 2011 through 2013, 2014, and how that possibly could be affecting us in terms of we've seen higher amounts of larger females in the past year and a half. That's a fact, and Sea Trade can show you on the pack out data that that's a fact. And that's one of the things I wonder about with that high pup rate back then, is that showing up now. I think there's enough uncertainty in the discard data to let this fire burn a couple more years to see if, hey, wait a minute, maybe we got it wrong a little and the industry survives. Because otherwise, the industry is going to collapse, and this biomass will have a chance to rebound as it always has because it's very resilient. And I thank you for your time.
All right. Thank you. With that, it's been a while, but I'm gonna read this back into the minutes again before we vote. I move that the council request NOAA Fisheries to take emergency action to allow a higher quota through the possible approach, given concerns related to National Standard 8 of the Magnuson-Stevenson Act. We're gonna vote on by the computer, please. All in favor, raise your hand on the computer. Rich? Okay. So, yeah, now you won on this one, okay? In 10 weeks, yeah. 1, 2, 10, 11, 12. You have? No. Oh. You got Rich. Yeah. Okay. Everyone put their hands down, please. All opposed, raise your hands online. You oppose? Yeah, and Jim Gilmore, 7.
Both 7.
Yeah. All right, everyone put their hands down. The motion passes 12-7. Any abstentions? Nope. Motion passes 12-7. With that, we're going to take a quick 5 minutes be enough. 5-minute break. Let's come back we'll make it 6 minutes, 11:38. Give an odd time.
So you voted against this or you abstained on this?
You voted against.
Just make sure. Yeah, that's right.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Jason, can you scroll up, I guess? All right, we're still trying to hash a few things out here, figure out what we can do and the proper way to do it. So with that, we're going to go to lunch. Come back at 1 o'clock. So it gives us 70 minutes to figure out exactly how we're going to word everything. So let's start back promptly at 1 o'clock. Thank you. And Paul, I'm going to have you give the scientific coordination subcommittee the outcome later on after that. Okay, so just giving you a heads up for later on this afternoon.
Okay, thank you. All set. Appreciate it.